Welcome, everyone. This is the virtual tour of Buddhist art, particularly the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art. So I have a presentation and I'm going to share it with you. The plan for the evening is that we'll go about 2.5 hours, and about midway, we'll stop. We'll have a little bit of a group breakout session and a little bit of a break, 10-minute or so break in the middle. And please feel free to jump in with comments or questions as I go along. You don't have to wait until the very end. And we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so can everybody see the slides? Actually, let me try one more time because I want to make sure we have the right version. Here we go, the right screen. So can everybody see that?
Yes.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, so here we are. And as I said, it's the Smithsonian NMAA, as we call it. And here in Washington, D.C., it's one of many free Smithsonian museums. So the Smithsonian Institution runs a large number of museums actually here in the D.C. area. And they recently celebrated their 100th anniversary, which is kind of fun. And now they're moving into their second century, as they call it. And there are 2 buildings joined underground with about 500,000 or so visitors per year, which is relatively small if we think about like the Air and Space Museum or the Natural History Museum of the Smithsonian. Those get many millions of visitors each year. So I'm just going to run this short video here. And I think y'all should just let me know if you can't hear it, okay? So here we are, in front of the Freer Gallery, one of 2 galleries that are part of the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art. We're going to go in here and have a look at some beautiful Buddhist objects. Yes, so this tour is going to be a little bit of a mix of actual footage that I shot yesterday and the live conversation that we're having. So the Freer Gallery, the one that I was standing in front of in that video, is the one that houses most of the Buddhist art, although there is some in the Sackler, and we'll see a bit of that at the end of the evening today. But the National Museum of Asian Art also surprisingly has a small collection of American art in it, which is also beautiful. But here's what you see when you walk into the building, the Freer building. It's a really beautiful space. You can see those gorgeous ceilings, very ornate ceilings, and the marble on the walls. And there at the end, right up the top of the steps there, is this courtyard. So this image here is the courtyard in the center of the Freer. They recently did a restoration of it and they opened it back up a few months back. And you can't go in from this door, but you can actually go into the courtyard from the other side of the building now. Yes, so one of the first objects you see as you come up those stairs, so the stairs lead to a hallway. The building is basically a square. If you can imagine, the courtyard is in the center and the building is a square. And what you see at both ends of the hallway that you come into in the Freer are these temple guardians. And I really appreciate these figures. You know, people often just walk right by them, but they're from Japan and they are known as the Nio in Japanese, the benevolent kings. But the tradition is also in China and in Korea, this tradition of having these fierce temple guardians. standing at the gates as you come in to a traditional, often Zen temple, but other kinds of temples as well. And this particular pair has an inscription on it that says it's from Erbaradera Temple, just south of Osaka in Japan, and that is from about the year 1235. And that was a period in Japan post a very, very difficult civil war. And so it was a time of really rebuilding, but it was also a time of great scarcity, or a feeling of scarcity among the folks. And I think about that in terms of these temple guardians. So the temple, you might think of them literally as being like yakshas, being a certain kind of deva called a yaksha in India. The yakshas were you could call them something like tree spirits. They were sometimes benevolent. They were sometimes not so benevolent. That's where we think this idea came from of having these guardians, because the yaksha would be depicted at the gates of the stupas in India many centuries before this, about 1,000 years before this. And or there are some of these guardian figures that have a vajra in their hand, a thunderbolt, and we think that that would come from Vajrapani. Vajrapani, who was a deity who was often depicted in India as being like the guardian of the Buddha. So I'm going to open my screen a bit so you can see them more closely. So these are a pair. So what we have here, this is the first one. This being is called Agyo, and he's called that because Ah is what he's saying. He has his mouth open there. And Ah is the first syllable of the Sanskrit alphabet. You see that he's very buff. He's got a lot of muscles. He's in this very, very fierce pose with the fist, and he has his hair in a bun, which is sort of typical of a warrior. And these figures would have been painted, so you can see that they're made out of wood. It's a beautiful method that was developed at this time in the Kamakura period in Japan, of joining blocks of wood together seamlessly, almost seamlessly. Now, after all these years, the paint has come off of them, and you can start to see a little bit of the joints, like here in the chest, and sometimes in the hands. But this is the other figure, and he is known as Ongyo. Let's see if we pronounce it correctly, Ungyo. And that's because Un is the last syllable in the Sanskrit alphabet. So they represent, you could say, sort of the beginning and the end of everything. And some people might literally believe that they were devas. That they were devas, that they were beings, very powerful beings, celestial beings. But also I think about it just in very practical terms. If one was approaching the temple with the intention of stealing something valuable, they had many beautiful, valuable objects, gold objects or jade objects, or, statues and so on. If one were to approach the temple with the idea of stealing something or doing harm to the temple, burning the temple down, which happened many times, these guardians might remind you that that's a bad thing to do, that bad things will happen, right? That's karmically not a good move. So in a very practical sense, I think that the guardians became popular. These two pieces are about 92 inches tall. You'll see in a few moments, I did a little bit of video of one of them. And throughout this presentation, what I've done is I've included some links here. So after the presentation, if you would like, you can share, or during the presentation, you can share your email in the chat, and I will send folks who are interested a link to a copy of the presentation so you can click through and see the videos again, see the images more up close, and also click through to the pages on the museum site. So these links here are to the Smithsonian site where you can go and learn more about any of these objects. And so here I have, just as a matter of comparison, a yaksha, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, from the stupa in Barhut. Barhut is like almost in the middle of India, the continent of India. And I'll say a lot more about the stupa. But anyway, so you can see the sort of precursor, if you will, of these fierce deities were these yakshas. Yaksha is the male and Yakshi is the female. So next to him is the female here. You can't see her very well. She's in the shadow. So that you could say the idea that inspired those, the Agyo and Ungyo. So this is another object that I want to point out, not this one, this is in Calcutta, so just to be absolutely clear, this is just here so to relate to the previous page. But this page, this part that I want to show you is this object over here, this railing fragment, this thing on the right. And so this is a carved piece of stone, and it is from the railing around the stupa in Barhut. So the Barhut stupa is one of the oldest, one of the most ancient Buddhist sites in the world, is believed to be from early 2nd century BC. It is, so a stupa is a place, usually it would have started out as a mound of earth, just a plain mound of earth, and it's said to contain the relics, the sort of bodily remains of awakened beings. Originally only the Buddha, but then later on other disciples, other arhants, other great teachers, and so on, would be, there would be bits of them in the reliquary, you know, a small, sometimes stone or a metal container. And then it would be buried under this mound. And eventually those earthen mounds were covered by plaster. And then years later, you know, over the centuries, they would get more and more adorned. So they would be eventually covered by bricks. That's what you see today if you go to India and look at these sites, is you see the remainders of the bricks that were on them. And they had these railings around them. So I'll show you another image in just a moment. But what I want to point out here is in pretty much detail here. This particular piece is showing the stupa, right? So it's a piece from the railing of the stupa, which is depicting the stupa, and it's depicting people, right? These people here. This is a woman, these are men with their turbans on. And then we have some deities up here, some kind of celestial beings, these devas flying in the sky. And what are they doing? They're showing what you do when you are at a stupa. This is basically like the instructional panel, if you will. It's showing people making offerings, bowing down. It's showing also the devas are making offerings on the right-hand side there. That celestial being is holding a flower garland. Even today, you can go to India and buy garlands of marigolds and garlands of flowers to place on the stupas. And so this panel is giving us some idea, perhaps, of what the stupa would have looked like at some point in its early history. But it's also telling us something about the nature of Buddhist practice at that time. What did people do at a sacred site like this? So, and Barhut, because it's one of the earliest, is not, yes, Richard.
I have a question. On the stoop at the very bottom is just all these handprints.
Uh-huh.
Wasn't there a kind of a, before they made images of the Buddha, didn't they have like use was it a handprint or a footprint to represent the Buddha?
It was usually a footprint or a parasol, because people would carry parasols over him,
Mhm.
or it would be the seat that he was sitting on. Usually not the hand. The hand is kind of unusual.
Yeah, I saw the hands at the bottom. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I saw that motif also. I would imagine that it has something more to do with like the community. Because in Barhut is in particular is a very interesting site because it was kind of crowdsourced. It was kind of it wasn't a place that was created at the behest of a king or one of the rulers. It was actually kind of community sourced. Anyway, so I'm not sure about the hands there and what that might represent, but it's probably I would not have first guessed that it was a representation of the Buddha. The stupa itself would be what people would think
Mhm.
of as the symbol of him, his presence. So here we have the Barhut stupa then and now. You see the difference. So on the right-hand side, that's a photo taken from Britannica. And basically you have this low bit of, let me make it larger here, a low bit of stone here in the front, kind of around, and then you see there's a little bit of the base of the mound left, and everything else has been either worn away by time or actually taken away by people. Oh, I see there's some things in the chat here, so hold on, let's see what's happening in the chat. Oh, good, okay, people are putting their emails, thank you. And
Where is this place?
Barhut, it's in the center of India, more or less in the center of India. It's in a province called current day Madhya Pradesh. So India is kind of like a triangle. It's a big at the white at the top and pointy at the bottom. And Barhut is, if you were to stick a pin nearly in the middle, it's about in there.
Interesting.
Yeah, in the central part of this continent. So this is what the stupa would have looked like, roughly speaking, and at another angle, right? So we had this kind of flat angle, this kind of flattened view on the carving, but I want to just show you a little bit more of this. So you have the mound itself, what's called the anda, the mound, and the mound has this sort of reference to the parasol. So I was saying earlier, oftentimes the Buddha was symbolized by a parasol. And on the top of these stupas, oftentimes they would put this kind of symbolic parasol at the top. So you have this big dome, and then you have the base of the dome here, and it's up high. Usually, as I said, over the centuries, they would make them bigger and bigger and bigger. I was just recently at many of these, but also one in Nepal that's very famous. And, it's like several stories high by now. And then you have the Vedika, you have the railing. And it's a very interesting way that they did it, because what happens is you come in this gate, and these gates are very, very ornate, absolutely stunningly beautiful, all fully carved with all sorts of beings on them and stories of the Buddha and so on. But then you come in and you walk around keeping the stupa to your right. So you circumambulate 3 times or multiples of 3 times. And as you're going around, there are, to your left, on the inside of the railing, stories also, images, carved images of the Buddha's life. So you can imagine that most people were not particularly literate at this time, and there wasn't even really a system of writing per se that was happening in India at that time, as far as I'm aware. And so everything was being taught by looking at these images and having people tell the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, of the Buddha's life here in India. So that's the Barhut Stupa. And stupas are very important to Buddhism because they represent the presence of all the important teachers. And then similarly, we have the life of the Buddha. So the life of the Buddha is typically told in at least 4 stories. And I'm going to run again this bit of video here for you so you can see. Now, I think we missed something here, though. So we're going to take a slow... Sorry, let me just go back 1 second because... Okay, no, we're good. So we're going to take a slow look at these 4 objects depicting key moments in the life of the Buddha. And these are the 4 here on the wall in the Indian ancient art room. In this first piece, you can see very clearly that this is depicting the birth of the Buddha. He's there emerging from the right side of Queen Maya or Maya Devi. So I'm just going to stop the video here for a moment because maybe it's a little hard to hear. There was another person speaking behind me. So this is a carved image of the Buddha being born. And it's from Gandhara. It's from an area in Central Asia, north of the top of India, north of what we know as India now. It's in areas that are now Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we know that partly because of this type of rock. This gray rock is called a schist, and it's from that area of the world. And we know that also because of the style of the carving here. But what we have is we have this woman standing here. This is Maya, Queen Maya. And she is giving birth. She's holding on to the tree, and she's giving birth standing up. She was on her way to her mother's house, but she didn't quite make it. And the Buddha is said to be born from her right side. And this has always been a fascination for me, and I think for many women. You know, I wonder whether they were trying to describe a cesarean section. She actually died about 7 days after the birth of the baby. And I imagine, you know, again, that they might not have had such good medical information. So that might have been the case. Or, you know, some people have taken it as a miracle. And this baby Buddha, certainly, he already has a halo and he already has an Ushnisha, this bump on the top of his head, which, you know, is sort of depicting this in a very miraculous form, because obviously when the Buddha was born, he was not already a Buddha. He was born a human being. His name was Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and we'll continue on with these panels, because there are 4 panels. It's often known. And then this next piece is a piece depicting the Buddha's awakening. So he has his hand in what we call Bhumi Parsha Mudra. He's touching the earth. And he's seated under the Bodhi tree. We can see the leaves, those lovely heart-shaped leaves of the Bodhi tree, the descendants of which are still there at the site where it's believed that the Buddha sat. How's the sound? Can you all hear what I was saying in the video? Yes? Okay, good. And beautiful, beautiful depiction. So let me just stop here and add a bit more. So we have, again, the Buddha who is depicted here in this style, this very unique style that came out of Gandhara, that has certain kinds of Greek influence to it, right? We can tell by this wavy style of the hair, a little bit of the way that the robe, the clothes are done. It's a very unique, beautiful style that came out of Gandhara. And we don't see that in India, this particular type of depiction of the Buddha. This of him seated, certainly, but not, again, this way that the robes are shown or this way that the hair is shown. But as I said, he's in Bhumi Parsha. This means touching the earth. So at the time that the Buddha was awakening, he describes himself as touching the earth as his witness that he was worthy of waking up. just to be an embodied being on this earth, in this earth, was enough to be worthy of waking up. And you see these figures below him. This is kind of interesting to me. These are the armies of Mara. So Mara is the sort of tempter, or Mara sometimes is called the devil, although I think that's kind of stretching it. Mara's more like a trickster, a bad jokester, and he is trying to keep people from waking up because that keeps them kind of in his sphere of influence, so to speak. And so Mara, when the Buddha is getting close to waking up, sends his armies to distract the Buddha or to attack the Buddha. And of course, you might imagine that, you might imagine this kind of literally, the Buddha speaking about beings that are not physically embodied like us. Or you might imagine this as the Buddha speaking about his shadow side, his kind of inner struggle to wake up. But he, in the end, he conquers Mara's army, not by fighting them, but by turning their arrows into flowers. So by really meeting violence and struggle with gentleness and compassion, the Buddha awakens. So these are Mara's armies here beneath him. And you see that there are a whole host of other beings. These are said to be celestial beings who were there to help him out. And then you have some other real-time beings, and these, again, would not have been there at the time he was waking up. He was sitting by himself, but they would have come later. The Buddha's moment of complete awakening, becoming the Buddha. And here we have the Buddha at Sarnath, the Buddha giving the first sermon or the first discourse. He went to the 5 ascetics, the 5 individuals with whom he had been previously practicing these very harsh, austere forms of renunciation, to teach them about the way that he had learned to awaken with joy and with ease. So just to point out a little bit of the symbolism here. So we have the Buddha with his hand in, this is fearlessness. This is giving the gift of fearlessness, or this is a way of kind of mudra that is about reassurance. And here we have at the bottom, we have the wheel of Dharma, right? So this first discourse at Sarnath is referred to as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. And so we see the wheel depicted here beneath him. And then finally we have this last piece. It's broken, it's missing a bit of it, but it's still a lovely, lovely piece. This particular carving depicting the Buddha's death, Buddha's passage into Mahaparinibbana. And he's lying there on his side, peacefully passing. You see the reactions, all sorts of reactions of the people who are present, all sorts of people present. So, yep. So just to say a little bit about the symbolism of this piece. Also, again, we have some celestial beings at the top. We have a monk here, one of the Buddha's followers. This is a Jain person, a naked person. So many of the Jains, Jains was another spiritual tradition that existed at the time of the Buddha and also continues to exist today. And they also had certain spiritual seekers, and their spiritual seekers would often even give up clothing. So they were said to be sky-clad, dressed in the sky. And so this is a Jain person here at the time of the Buddha's death. And here we have, sitting in front of him, we have a person just sitting quietly and meditating without too much reaction that's visible on the face. And this is said to be Supada. Supada was the last person that the Buddha ordained. So all of this is told in the long discourse number 16, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, and you can read more about that there. But just to go back and have a look at all four pieces. These are the depictions of the Buddha's life, which were used for teaching the story of his life, but also used as a way to recollect him, to remember his contributions to humanity. Yes. And so these four objects also represent the four sacred sites, right? Lumbini, where he was born, Bodh Gaya, where he was enlightened, Sarnath, where he gave the first discourse, and Kushinagar, where he passed into Mahaparinibbana. And here we have another kind of expression. So we've been looking at different types of expression of practice, right? So the first object we saw was about devotion around the stupas and about the way that the teachings were being taught based on these carvings that were in the stupa railings and the stupa sites. And then we looked at, we first started looking at the temple guardians and a little bit about the idea of ethics and how ethics might be enhanced by the types of objects that we see at a temple. And then we looked at the Barhut Stupa, and then these moments of the Buddha's life, those are related again to the pilgrimage sites as a practice or to actual recollection of the Buddha. Just remembering the Buddha is also said to be a beneficial practice. And then lastly, I'm going to come to this one, and then I think we have one more slide before the small group. So this is a beautiful piece. It's actually not on display right now at the Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art, but it is a piece that I felt was worth bringing forward and having you have a look at, because it's beautiful, and it's a fairly not common to see this kind of thing here in the States anyway, as far as I have seen. And this is called a Kammawacha, and it's a manuscript that is printed on these thin copper plates. So back in the day, copper became the way that pronouncements were made, because you could make the plate, the copper plate, and write on it, whoever had the literacy to write on it, and then it would last for a long time. So the decrees of the nobles were available. They wouldn't just disintegrate. And so the copper plate became a way of recording the Dharma and recording various kinds of laws. But now this much later, this is a piece from the 19th century, so it's not that old, relatively speaking, to what we've been looking at so far. But it's still done on copper plates, and it's this red ink is used to make these very, very ornate, here we'll see if we can make them bigger, these very, very ornate drawings of devas, of guardian devas. So you can see that this deva looks quite different from the one that we were looking at the beginning of our talk today, right? Those fierce deities in the Japanese temples, the Neo. This is a different form of a deva. And this is an object from Burma, which now called Myanmar. And they have this beautiful script here, right? This very, very unique form of writing. And it's called tamarind seed script because it looks like the tamarind seed, the shape of the characters. And this object would have been commissioned, would have been made by the family of a family who was sending their son to become a monk temporarily. So in Burma, also in Thailand, there is a practice of boys being sent to the monastery for brief periods of time, oftentimes a week, a few weeks, a few months to live the monastic life, to learn something about ethics and about how to be in society, what are the values that they wanted them to uphold, their families wanted them to uphold, and their society wanted them to uphold. And so the family would commission one of these to make as an offering. And what it does is it records a portion of the monastic rules. So lay people have in the Theravada tradition, this would have been Theravada tradition, 5 precepts, 5 ethical rules, guidelines. And then there is the 8 precept form, which is also a lay form, but then a little bit more renunciation, sort of somebody who's thinking about becoming a monastic would take on the 8 precepts. It's known as an anagarika form or an anagaraka form, female and male. And then you have the 10 precepts of the samaneri or samanera, female and male. And then you have the hundreds of precepts of the full bhikkhuni or bhikkhu. And so this would have been a limited number, right? It says an excerpt of the monastic code that is the whole body of which is called the Vinaya. So we think about Buddhism as being 3 baskets, and the 3 baskets are the suttas or the discourses of the Buddha and his disciples. And then you have the Vinaya, which is the monastic order and sort of the stories behind how the monastic rules were developed. There's also some stories about the Buddha's life in the Vinaya. And then you have the Abhidhamma, which is the sort of analytic analysis, the sort of compendium of trying to make an analysis of the other 2. But I brought this forth because I think it's a beautiful object, and it talks about 2 different kinds of practice that we might also relate to, right? So it talks about how the families make offerings or support the communities. And it also talks about how people would aspire to become a monk. So in Burma, according to what I've read, the practice was that the boys would be very young when they did this temporary monk. They might be as young as 7 years old or 8 years old. And they would do it for a very short period. But then once they turn 20, they are considered adult enough to make a decision about whether they want to join the monastic order or not. And that's also in the Vinaya. That's also in the rules that people had to have a certain age of maturity to go forth. So it's a beautiful piece of art, and again, it represents a particular way that one society has engaged with the practice of Buddhism in various ways, in the lay form and in the monastic form. Okay, so now we're going to take a break, and I think I'm running a little bit early. Yeah, but that's okay. Well, this might be a good time. So, the small group discussion, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. How many folks do we have? Oh, we only have enough for one small group. So why don't we just do one group discussion? How about that? And so the question before us is something about place, yeah? Because one of the things that we were bringing forth was how different places, right, are doing this practice. And so the question before us is something like that. Is there a special place, or perhaps there's a special practice, type of devotion, or a particular type of practice that you can relate to one of these objects and or some Buddhist art object? Is there something that inspires you or that feels like a special place for you or a special object for you? Okay, now don't all jump in there at once.
I'm not sure that I understand what kind of object or place. Like, we have the places that we meditate, or do you mean out in nature, or what kind of object? Like
Yeah, I mean, it could be anything. I guess what I'm just trying to see if there is something. So, for example, what we've seen so far is we saw a stupa site, we saw some guardians that are related to a temple, we saw some different this object, which is part of the list of the monastic rules. So, is there some place like a temple or a place in the world or something that you feel is particularly close to your practice?
I could start with a couple places. In terms of places, I think there are a couple places where I've done meditation enough that when I go there, when I just get there, I just feel like I take it all in and just sigh, and then there's just feeling of like I'm home. One of those places is the Bhavana Society in West Virginia. I mean, I drive down that driveway, or walk into, I started meditating there. My very first meditation retreats were there for years. So there's that place. And the other is up at the Forest Refuge up in Barre, Massachusetts. I go there and I just feel like there's just this release. Again, this kind of this sense of a refuge, and I'm home now. So those are two places that I can start with. I have some objects, but I'm going to let others talk first.
Okay, yeah, let's do places first, and then maybe we'll come back to objects if we have time.
I can continue. Yeah, I second that, Susan. I haven't been to the Forest Refuge, but I will be hopefully later this year. But at Spirit Rock, I've been there several times, and it's just like, oh, yes. And prior to that, the Insight Meditation Society have gone there. And then in terms of my personal refuges, I'm a transplant the last almost 2 years from Minnesota, and spent a lot of time with kayaking and canoeing, and just being up in nature on the water and with the trees. It's like, it just doesn't get any closer. Yeah. So those are my places.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you both. Yeah, so I'll share, and then we can continue if you like. But now I'm thinking there are two places. I also have two places that I would like to mention. One is my teacher's temple. So it's called Hoshinji, and it's a little teeny town, little teeny fishing village in Japan called Obama is the name of the town, on the backside of the main island of Honshu. And yeah, that place is very, very special, very, very special to me. A lot of very formative memories, good and more difficult ones, and everything all kind of wrapped in there together, but very, very special place for me. And I would say also Chuanyin. So there's a big monastery up in in the upstate New York, about, I don't know, maybe 2 hours, I guess it is, north of New York City, maybe 2.5 hours. And it's where Bhikkhu Bodhi lives. And it's a big Chan monastery. He's a Theravada monk, but it's a Chan monastery. But anyway, they have this enormous, like multi-story high Buddha they had to build a building around the Buddha. They built the Buddha and then they built the building around the Buddha because the Buddha is so big. And anytime I walk into that building, the sense of just like what I only could call spiritual energy is absolutely pervasive. I mean, I always end up just sitting down there and meditating for a long time, or, doing prostrations, or because it's just a very, very special place. It's the only large Buddha that I know of in the States, actually, one of these big, many, many stories high.
I recently was at the San Francisco City Center for the Zen Center. And for me, that was a really wonderful, wonderful place for me to visit. I really enjoyed it. It was like, I'd always wanted to go there. I never went there. When I was young, I never went there when I lived in the Bay Area. But going back and sitting there and meditating and listening to Dharma talks, it was just delightful. It's like home.
Mm, mm, mm. Nice.
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything they want to share? I see Mark said he's in a noisy space. So. No, we're good right now. Yeah. Okay. All right, folks. So what do we have? It's about 10 minutes to 7 Eastern time, East Coast time. So we'll take about a 10-minute break and we'll come back at the top of the hour. Okay? See you then. Okay, great. So we're back for the second half of our workshop. And so I'm going to share screen again. I'm going to continue looking at some more objects from the Asian Museum. Okay. I can make sure that. Okay. So we're going to move on to the early Chinese art and see another part of the museum. So I did a bit of a recording here so you could just see again a little bit of the inner space and what it's like to actually visit there. And moving down to the other end of the museum to have a look at the Chinese art. So the Smithsonian has... Sorry, hold on one second. I just want to turn it up a bit. Okay. Divided the Chinese art. So the Smithsonian has divided its galleries up primarily by country, rather than doing it by the types of materials or by the period of time or by the themes, although they do have rooms that are devoted to specific themes. But here's the other guardian. This is the guardian that says the last syllable in the Sanskrit alphabet. And this is the room of early Chinese Buddhist art. So you can see that I'm not a video expert, but nonetheless, you get a little feel for what it's like to walk around the museum there. And yeah, so primarily sculpture in this particular gallery here, and primarily stone with a few smaller objects in bronze. So the piece that I want to talk about here is a piece called the Cosmic Buddha. This is a very, very interesting piece. I would say it's one of the highlights of the Smithsonian Asian collection. And Harvard art historian Karen Wong called it a celebrated enigma. And I thought that was very appropriate because it is an object that has been very, very intensely studied for a very long time, studied both in terms of its material properties as well as its history. And still, there's quite a lot of debate about what it is, what it means, what it's trying to represent, what it's trying to depict here. So it's a statue, a carved piece of limestone, calcitic limestone in particular, which tells us that it's from a certain part of, relatively speaking, northeastern China, not in the very northeastern corner, but northern Qi dynasty. And that means about 6th century, latter part of the 6th century. Again, there's been some debate about the exact timing, but that's more or less where folks have landed these days. And this is a photo that was taken by Dave's son. Some of you might know Dave. He's been here numerous times in the past. And this is a group of folks that went in person to the Smithsonian together with me. I think it was last year, actually. And we went and had a look at this piece, as well as many of the other pieces we've spoken about today. We will be actually going in person on May 10th. So if anybody is in the area and wants to actually go see, that would be the time to do it. But there is the statue. And it's been in the succession number. The way that they do their accession numbers, and many museums do, is that the first part of the number is the year that it was acquired. So this piece has been in the Smithsonian collection for over 100 years now. Since the beginning of the collection, basically, right? And the big question, or one of the big looming questions around this piece is it a Shakyamuni Buddha or is it a Vairochana Buddha? So it is a Buddha of some sort. That's what we think, even though we don't have the head or the hands. It seems pretty clear, and I'll show you a little bit about why we think that it's clear that it's a Buddha. But the question of which Buddha is an interesting one. And so Shakyamuni Buddha, just to be clear, is the historical Buddha, the man who was born in Lumbini and enlightened at Bodh Gaya in India and so on. Vairochana Buddha is more of a conceptual Buddha. Vairochana Buddha, I'll say more about him in a little bit, or them or it in a little bit. But Vairochana Buddha we could think of as the Buddha of the all reality, the name that we put on, or the face that we put on all reality. So the answer about whether this is a Shakyamuni Buddha, it's a depiction of the historical personage in a very fancy robe, or whether this is a depiction of a Buddha, an enlightened being that represents the whole universe, is not such a simple question. So this piece may represent many different texts. It may be actually carved by more than one artist, and those things may have all happened in different time frames even. So one reason that we say that is just to point out some of these details for you. And I did a whole article on this piece. I actually did a paper on this piece as part of my master's degree in Buddhist art history. And I put a link to that here in the presentation, and it's also available on the blog of the website. But for example, you can see that there's this very clear indentation here at the bottom of the robe. And then these carvings here are sort of separate. You can kind of see that there's some space there. It's not a continuous image. So there's some idea that maybe some of this was added later. There's also different places on the piece where the carving is slightly more sharp or less sharp. And so sharper carvings would mean more recent. They've seen less wear. Limestone is a particularly soft stone to be carving in, so it definitely shows its wear. It has a tendency to smooth. So that's a little bit of what's happening here in the belly. You can see some smoothing. Maybe if I get it up close, you can see a little bit better. And you can see these little fractures along the edge of the robe here, right? So small pieces coming off. And basically, though, what's happening here, let me just back off slightly. So what this depiction is on this robe is the realms of existence. So up here you have the celestial realms, and then here you have like a kind of lower deva realm, and then you have a human realm, and then you have another kind of there's a realm where we see the Buddha stupa actually after the Buddha's death, his parinibbana. And then down here we have some hell realms. And then we have even more hell realms below that line. And, but the whole piece is carved, even the sleeves, the back, and everything. And so it's not a simple question. Standing Buddha from China, very, very ornately carved piece of limestone. And I'm going to say quite a bit more about this piece, but I wanted you to see it in context, see it in the context of the room that it's in, get a sense for the ease. You see the roundedness of the belly there, the softness of the shoulders. And again, just how ornate, incredibly detailed the carving is from top to bottom and on all sides. Yep, so even on the back here, we see a number of different realms of existence. So this is a Maitreya. So Maitreya lives in the Tusita heaven, in the heaven that is said to be the closest to the human realms. And then we have this middle realm with certain kinds of spirits. We're not really sure what that realm is. And then we have this very interesting scene with a lot of horses that doesn't really seem to relate to anything. It's just kind of horses at the tail end there. So what's happening here? So many Buddhas in many realms. If anything can be said about this piece, definitively it is that, right? So it's this life-size piece. It's been put on this block, right? So the Smithsonian added that block of cement at the bottom in order to stabilize it so that it could stand up still. But the piece itself is about 60 inches tall. And it's a very, there was one academic that really said very beautifully that the cloth of the robe reveals a body rather than hiding it. Right, so if we think about the robes that we saw in some of the earlier Buddhas, the robe is very, you get a sense of kind of thick, this very nicely folded, heavy piece of fabric, and you don't get much of a sense of the body underneath the fabric. Whereas in this one, you definitely have a very embodied sense of a human underneath that robe. But as I said in the recording, there is this very beautiful sense of ease of the piece, and it is replete with images. And what's fascinating to me, and I don't know whether they intended this or not, but so there's the piece itself, this statue that stands in the center of the room there, the ancient Chinese art room. And then on another floor, a couple floors down, in the other building, actually, I believe, if I remember correctly, in the Sackler building, there is this interactive display. So they have a little tiny Buddha. I'll make it bigger here so you can see. They have a little tiny Buddha that they made a replica of, and you can touch different parts of the Buddha, and it will tell you in the interactive display what's carved there, what we think that image, that particular picture is supposed to represent. So in a way, what the Smithsonian has done, and again, I don't know whether this is intentional or not, but what they've done is they have actually done what the statue says. They have created many Buddhas in many realms. They have multiplied the Buddhas in different realms. So it's very, very interesting, I think, fascinating to me that that's what happened with this piece. And the other thing that we can say is, again, there are many Buddhas actually portrayed on the piece. So the piece itself is, here we have the Buddha of the past. So I'm going to make this much larger so you can see here. So you can see this is the right sleeve of the robe. And you have this being here kind of bending down, and it has this long thing. This is the hair, okay? And this is a Buddha here with a halo and a little Ushnisha that we know, right? So the Ushnisha is that kind of lump at the top of the head. That is one of the defining characteristics of a Buddha that sort of is an expression of their wisdom. And this is the story of the Buddha receiving the prediction from a prior Buddha. So this Buddha who's depicted here is Dipankara Buddha, a Buddha of many eons in the past. And this was Sumedha, I believe was his name at that time. And he sees that Dipankara is about to step in a puddle, and he's so impressed by him that he puts his hair down on the road so that Dipankara can walk on his hair and not get his feet dirty. And by this act of devotion, he gets an opportunity to speak with Dipankara Buddha, of the Buddha of, again, many, many, many eons ago. And Dipankara makes the prediction that in a future life, he, this being who put his hair down, will become a Buddha. And so this is, in many, 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 many lifetimes later, Shakyamuni Buddha. This is how Shakyamuni Buddha gets the prediction from the previous Buddha. So we see an image of Dipankara, and Dipankara Buddha isn't very often depicted, I have to say. We don't see him all over the place. That's a pretty unique depiction. And then we have the Shakyamuni Buddha. So this is Shakyamuni Buddha, and this is a little boy offering him a handful of mud. He didn't really have anything else to offer, but he was so moved by seeing the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, that he offers the Buddha a handful of mud. And this little boy who offers the Buddha a handful of mud receives the prediction from the Buddha that he will be Maitreya. He will be the Buddha of the future. So this is the second story of prediction, which is just a ways up further on the same arm, actually, as the Dipankara story. Whoop. And then finally, we have the image of Maitreya. So that was the one I pointed to earlier on the back of the figure. We have a very clear, what seems to me anyway, a very clear image of the future Buddha. So how do we know the future Buddha? So the future Buddha usually has very elaborate hair. He is a lay person at this point, right? He's not a monastic or anything. This is Maitreya. Maitreya is the Buddha of the next Buddha, the Buddha of the future. And he usually has very nice jewelry, and he also has his legs in this V formation. So he has his kind of feet, he's crossed at the ankles. This is the way that he is often depicted, sitting crossed at the ankles. But he has his hand in this mudra that we see from the Buddha, this mudra of giving reassurance. Don't worry, I'm coming. When it's his turn, he comes down from the Tusita heaven. And so we see what's called the Buddha of the three times, right? The past, the present, and the future. Now, what would make us think that this is Shakyamuni Buddha? Well, if we look at other Buddhas from China from that period of time, they look very, very similar, right? Look at the way that the robes hang here. Let me just open it up again. If we can see the way that the robes hang kind of straight. We can see the positioning of the hands. We can see this softness, beautiful softness of the belly, right? We see this softness, a rounded shoulder. Even the stance, right? This kind of straight up stance. There's no bend at the knee. This one also, look at this, right? The soft belly, the soft shoulders, this straight up and down way that the robe is hanging there on the side. Very, very similar, right? So we look at these and we might say, oh, that's definitely a Shakyamuni. Looks like those other three Shakyamunis to me. That's plenty of evidence. But then, and actually Angela Howard, so she's a very, very respected art historian of Chinese art especially, she called this piece, the Smithsonian Cosmic Buddha, she called it the highest form of Buddha Shakyamuni in an article that she wrote about it in 1984. But then we look at some other things that might also relate to this robe, right? This absolutely stunningly unique and detailed robe with these depictions of different layers of being, realms of being. And so these drawings over here are the line drawings of some paintings that are in the walls of the caves in Kizil. So Kizil are the caves in the very, very far northwestern corner of China. They would have been sort of the entryway of the Silk Road from the Gandhara, from that region we talked about in Central Asia. Folks were migrating up through India sometimes, through Gandhara and over to China to sell their goods. And then they would grab goods in China, buy goods in China, and then bring it back the other way. And Kizil is one of the very first outposts in China they would have come to. And there are these very, very ancient, not well-preserved caves. And on these caves, you see these two very, very interesting figures. And they are called the cosmological Buddhas. But they're called cosmological Shakyamuni, which is kind of funny. But anyway, they also have, see this, these robes with the realms of existence, or with different, you could say, layers of beings all the way down, right? From the collar all the way down the sleeve. Same with this one. You see you have a layer here, and a layer there, and a layer there, and then you have some folks on the sleeves. This one is a little bit different. It has some unusual symbols, some kind of perhaps looking like Vajrayana style symbols, although this was well before the Vajrayana was in India and China. But nonetheless, these might look kind of similar, and these objects are now known as Vairocana, as the Buddha of the whole cosmos, Vairocana. So it looks kind of similar to that too, right? So I want to say this. If we step back and we think about it from the perspective of Buddhism, not from the perspective of a text. So sometimes what happens is that the people can get very tangled up in a particular text or a group of texts. But I want to look at it from the general perspective of Buddhism. So what we have in the 4th century is we have Asanga, who develops this doctrine called the Trikaya, or the 3 bodies of Buddha. Kaya means body, and Tri is 3. And the 3 bodies of Buddha are, and I'm just going to say it briefly rather than go through all this detail that's here. You have the Dharmakaya, and the Dharmakaya is pure, ultimate consciousness. It represents all of reality. And again, the name that we put on this, or the sort of face that we put on this, is Vairocana Buddha. Vairocana. Then you have the Sambhogakaya, and the Sambhogakaya is the body of enjoyment, meaning it's not a physical body or a body that decays in any way. It's a body that arises in a pure realm or in a heavenly realm. So like Maitreya, who's waiting up in the Tusita heaven, is an example of Sambhogakaya. Yeah. And then we have nirmanakaya. And nirmana means it's transforming. So the transformation body is the body that is born, ages, and dies. So that kind of Buddha is Shakyamuni Buddha, right? He's born into the world. He goes through a process of awakening. He goes through a process of getting old and aging and getting sick and then dying. So that is the Nirmanakaya, Shakyamuni Buddha. Also, Dipankara Buddha was a Nirmanakaya Buddha. He had a body, he existed at a certain time, and then he died. So we have this theory, and this theory arose in Buddhism partly as a way to try to understand how it is that we could have Buddhas in other realms. How is it that Maitreya is in the Tusita heaven? Or how is it that, as the story goes, the Buddha went up to the Tusita heaven to talk to his mom, to talk to Mayadevi after she died, and give her the teachings of awakening for her next rebirth. So these are kind of, again, we have to kind of wrap our minds around the idea of realms of existence or realms of being. What does it mean to have many Buddhas, and can they all coexist? And I don't think we need to resolve that today, but I do want to say this, that I think that this object, my theory is, as I said in my paper, that this object is representing that concept, the concept of the three bodies of Buddha. So what art historians usually do, the traditional method of analysis of a Buddhist object like this that has different pictures on it, if you will, like even a cave or, a painting, any of those things, is that you try to map the scenes to a sutra or a sutta. You try to map those scenes to a text, a scene from a text, right? But what happened when art historians tried to do that with this particular piece from the Smithsonian is that it doesn't fit very neatly. You can't identify all of these scenes as representing a particular sutta, either one sutra or even many sutras. There are some scenes that cannot really be clearly identified as coming from a text at all, as far as we can tell. And the other problem with that is that it requires a tremendous amount of knowledge, right? So why would somebody sculpt, maybe spend years actually, if you look at this piece, sculpting an object that nobody can understand, right? It doesn't kind of make sense. So, but if we view this piece, this Buddha, as a depiction of a concept, as a depiction of the three bodies of Buddha, so it could be all three. It could be Shakyamuni Buddha and Maitreya Buddha and Vairocana Buddha, all depicted in various ways in this one object. And what is the beauty of that? Well, the beauty of that, the elegance of that solution, is that then the viewer can find the Buddha that they're looking for. If you're somebody who wants to pray to Vairocana or make offerings to Vairocana, then you can see Vairocana in this thing. If you are somebody who is a Theravada practitioner, let's say, somebody who's practicing from the ancient texts, and you want to honor Shakyamuni Buddha, then you have a Shakyamuni Buddha, right? If you are concerned about Maitreya, which was actually very, very popular, Maitreya was very, very much a figure of hope in all along the Silk Road, but certainly in China, then this could represent hope as well, right? Because he has Maitreya on the back. He's telling that story that Maitreya is coming. So the elegance of this form is that you don't have to know 15 different sutras, and you don't have to stand there and understand every single panel. You can just attend to the piece according to whichever body of Buddha you're looking for. So that's my analysis of this piece from the Smithsonian. And again, it's certainly up for discussion. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll do that. But there's one more thing that I want to show you before we get to the Q&A. And actually, we're running kind of quickly here tonight. So, and that is the immersive part of the Asian Museum. So, as I said, there are two buildings. The buildings are connected underground, or you can walk around outside to either one. And one of the exhibitions that is probably the most unique, one of the most unique exhibitions there at the Smithsonian is this immersive Tibetan Buddhist monastery. So they've created a room where you can go in and have a sort of experience around that. So I really recommend that you keep your volume up high because you're going to want to hear the chanting that's happening in the room there. And the visit to the, hold on, let me just also make sure that mine is up high so that you can hear it. Well, Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art would not be complete without a visit to the immersive Tibetan Buddhist exhibition. So you cross over from the West Building, from the Freer Building to the East Building, which was originally called the Sackler Building. And you come down to level B1 and around the corner, and you find yourself here in this hallway. And you can see this gentleman seated in front of the space. So it's an immersive space for Tibetan Buddhist sacred objects. We have a really wonderful interpretive panel here. And then you go into the room. You can hear, it'll be quiet so you can hear the chanting. This is the main altar of the shrine right here. Great. So what is very unique about this particular way of exhibiting Buddhist art is, again, this immersive experience. And what they've done is they've brought together a large number of different types of objects, right? So you see some statues, and just even if we look at this one little corner here, right, we have statuary, we have tanka paintings on the wall, we have musical instruments, a very important part of Tibetan Buddhist practice. We have the chanting. So I don't know if you all were able to hear. It's just a kind of low hum on the recording, but and they've turned it down, I think, since the last time I was there. But it's that very, very deep style of chanting that the Tibetan monks do. And then they even have the offerings. So I don't know if you noticed that there was some rice offerings there in front of the main shrine. And there are some candles, right? Little electric candles, because they don't allow anything burning in the museum. But it's a really beautiful space. I'm certainly not prepared to speak to all of the objects that are in there. As I said, they have this lovely interpretive panel, though. There's an interpretive panel there, which is a touch screen, and you can kind of open it up, and then it has an image of the main part of the shrine, and you can touch different objects, and it will tell you what the objects are. And this is a style of exhibition that was not actually created by the Smithsonian. It's been done at a couple of other museums. The Rubin, also up in New York, had, I think they're closed now, but they had a room like this where you could step in, and it's been done in some other places as well. But it's a beautiful way to really get a sense of the sort of cultural immersion of what it would be like to be practicing in that form, in that place. And so, the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya take shape in stone, or sometimes in bronze, or sometimes in copper, and demonstrate the unity of the teachings and the ability of art to intrigue us by showing us the ineffable. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. And we still have quite a bit of time left, actually. So if there are any comments or questions, we could go back and look at other pieces more specifically. Or yes, Lisa.
This is really interesting because I was planning on going to the art museum. I've been to like the National History Museum, but I've never really been to an art museum. But I feel the need for some reason. So I'm a little bit shocked, I guess, that they have, that the statues are not enclosed; they're out and out and open like that. I mean, you can't touch though. I mean, or can you?
No, they would stop you if you were
Mhm.
trying to touch something. But I almost did one time. But yeah, the statues are just right there on the stand.
Yeah, that's really, really shocking because yeah, again, I've only been to like the National History Museum and never to like any um, art. Because even the art museums, I guess they have like the paintings on the wall, I guess out in the open the same way. They're not enclosed. But
Yep.
very, very nice.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I'm sure it would be a really great experience, Lisa. And as I said, we're going together as a group. We're going to take a group of folks out there on May 10th, around 10 o'clock when the museum opens. And but yeah, I think this is a good way also to talk a little bit about the fact that we call this art, right? So it's interesting too, because if we look at these, like that railing from Barhut, that took the place of a book in a sense back then, right? There wasn't really a book to speak of. You would just carve the story right there on the stupa. And so it's I don't think that those artisans, they would have thought of themselves as artisans. They probably would have, but I don't think that they ever imagined such a thing as a museum back then. It was like, this is a holy place, and this is part of what that means. The same thing for that statue. Like, we have no idea where that statue was in China, but it was like, carved out. What you could tell when they received it was that there was this big chunk of stone. So it had been just carved out, actually, in some place, maybe one of the cave sites. So we call it art, and it is art in the sense of beauty and in the sense of depiction and so on, but and craft, certainly skill and creativity. But it's interesting because it wasn't meant to be in a museum originally.
I wouldn't think of it any other way, because the Christian traditions are all the same. that most of all through the Renaissance, all that was created in honor of God or the religious, they put the stories there because most of the people were illiterate. So you had to do a painting or, of stained glass or something so that people could follow along. So it's really not any different. What I find really interesting is the skill that they had in depicting the human form so much earlier than you saw in Europe. Because they had the Greek guys went over there and they didn't have the fall of the Roman Empire and all that upheaval. They just kept the skill. Whereas the Romans kind of they lost their workforce in order to continue to pass on the knowledge. But it's just the skill to do that, like to be able to carve something where you can see the human form underneath it. It's really hard to do. Yes. Really skillful.
Very skillful.
And the anatomy is pretty much perfect too. I don't know if you know this, what were attitudes towards dissecting bodies, like studying the human form to see the musculature and how that fit together. Do you know?
I don't know about that part, whether that was happening in those parts of the world at that time. I think what's interesting is that if we look at like Roman and Greek art from that period of time or from slightly after that period of time, it's like the ideal was completely different, right? Those guys were interested in like getting all the individual muscles in there and, and there was this very, very strong desire for realism, like a kind of realism, like like photorealism almost, right? And you have these right, these like warrior types with it's flex biceps and such.
It's actually super realism because it's right. And one of the things that comes out is ordinary bodies are not particularly interesting. Like look at all of us. Really, our bodies are not that interesting, right? We look way better with clothing on, right? But it's we see that what we look at is something that is different from what we have. It's kind of it just takes it that much further in the perception of beauty. So it's kind of interesting that way.
Like a kind of idealized realism was what the Greek and Roman, form of artistic idea was. Whereas if you look at India and you look at China, right, it's like they weren't trying to do that. They were trying to depict the qualities of the person, like that sense of ease. If you're an enlightened being, you have no stress. So what does a no stress body look like? It looks like that, right? It looks like this very, very soft, beautiful form, relaxed form.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But it's just to sort of look at the differences between the two. And it is so much more real.
Yes.
I have a question along those lines. So how was this, what was the kind of process for developing this art? Was it like in the Renaissance where there would be a very rich person who essentially wanted to make an offer, sort of a commission, and then they hired, where they're like the workshops of artisans that they hired, and there's so much. I guess there is in the Christian tradition too, but there's so much symbolism of Buddhism. I was wondering if they would work at all with monastics, say, people more sophisticated in Buddhist symbolism to develop that. Do you have any idea about kind of how that all worked?
Yes. So definitely the stone carvers were working together with the monastics directly, oftentimes, but it would be patronized. It would often be patronized by whoever was, the king or the ruler at that time, the ruling clan in that particular area, and like Ashoka, right? We know that a couple hundred years after the Buddha, Ashoka developed this very large empire, not as large as India is now, but he developed this large empire. And part of the way that he tried to unify his empire was that he put these very tall pillars with Buddhist statements on them, like try to be ethical and try to tell the truth and these kinds of things all over the place, right? So this is how a little bit of how we learned about how Buddhism spread after the fact. But yes, anyway, going back to your question, the monastics and the artisans would work together. Eventually, there were these texts called the Silpa Shastras. So they were Sanskrit texts that were for the silpas. Silpas are different kinds of artisans. And so each type of artisan, you know, like potters and sculptors and metal workers and woodcrafters and so on, would each have their instruction set, so to speak. The main problem being that we don't have any idea. We have many of those different texts. They're all slightly different, and we don't really have any way to date them. So we don't know. And the final thing being that we don't know if that's describing an ideal or if that's describing what was actually happening at the time, right? The two things could be quite different. It could be like, this is the ideal, but people weren't really following it. But long story short, there were ways that the monastics would work together to tell them, and this is why you can sometimes map the text, not always, but sometimes, right? And the monastics would say, oh, I've memorized the Lotus Sutra, and wouldn't it be lovely if we could have an image of this beautiful bodhisattva of compassion that is described in chapter 27. And then he would read chapter 27 to the artisan, right? Or recite it to them. And that would be that. So that's part of how it happened. Then as we get into the later centuries, especially in China, the nobles got very involved. The emperors and the empresses, they got very involved, and they would sponsor these huge devotional sites. That's how we have most of the cave sites in India, in China rather, because of the sponsorship of the emperors and the royal families in China, and they would, you know, say, I want it to be after such and such a text, because by that time things were being written down and texts were coming from India into China, and people would get inspired by some text and say, I want, you know, a copy of this or a copy of that inscribed. But the skill and the craft of it is something that had already been developing. In fact, in India, there's evidence. There's a very good book, I was just looking at it the other day, called The Indus by Andrew Robinson, about Indus civilization, right? So before India was India, a long time before even the Buddha's time, thousands of years, 5,000 BC, more or less. And those folks already had copper development. They already knew how to make bronze. And they were making small bronze objects and jewelry and things like that. So that, you know, the workmanship was kind of passed on traditionally. And then it was the question of who was telling them what form, right? Yeah. Yeah.
What's the name of that book again?
It's called The Indus. Here, I'll show it to you. If I can get it off the shelf. It's a very good book. I got this at the British Museum, so you know that it's credible scholarship because they were selling it at the bookstore in the British Museum. And it's called The Indus by Andrew Robinson.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, really fascinating what we know and what we don't know about that period of time. But yeah, the art, the craftsmanship was incredible, absolutely incredible.
The thing about the statue was the struck me as the fabric that the illustrations were on was like a silk. It was like, because the body could be seen through it.
Mm,
It was like silk,
yeah.
really fine silk.
Yeah, it is. And to Linda's point as well, it's like I think about some very famous Italian statues, marble
Mhm.
statues, right? That are famous specifically for that reason, because it's
Right.
like a woman in a veil, right? And you have basically a thing in stone that looks like incredibly realistic depiction of a person, and a very, very kind of diaphanous, very, very, airy kind of fabric.
Yeah, they have a couple of those kinds of statues at the High Museum here in Atlanta. They're
Mm-hmm,
amazing to see that they
mm-hmm,
could do that in stone.
mm-hmm.
They could show, you could get that sense of transparency of a
Yep,
fabric on
yep,
someone's face. It's like,
right.
oh, God, it's amazing.
It's an incredible skill. It's an
It's,
incredible skill. And the time that it would have taken somebody to carve that, that again, that degree of detail, that many different types of scenes, somebody having to tell them, unless they knew somehow, somebody telling them, that the realms are like this. You have the celestial realms here, and then you have this realm and that realm. It's got a heck of a lot of hell on it.
well, it's important to show the realms,
Uh-huh. It's important to show the results, right? Which
Right.
way are you going?
Yeah, want to scare you a little bit here. I have a question. The thing that always gets me, there's a beautiful statue of Guan Yin at the Nelson Museum in Kansas City. And
Mm,
they've got this beautiful statue in the royal pose. And then behind Guan Yin is the wall from the temple, right? The actual wall from this temple.
yes.
I always wonder about this because it's a really amazing piece. But it's like, how did they ever get it? I mean, it's like this statue of this beautiful statue you talked about, unknown statue. Um, it's like,
The cosmic Buddha.
how did they ever get it? Did somebody say, "Well, look, I'll give you 20,"
Yeah, exactly.
you know?
Somebody blasted it out of the ground, right? I mean, and this is a thing that you see very commonly in museums all around the world, in France, in Germany, in Britain, in the US sometimes. You see pieces, literal like hunks of wall that have been blasted off the wall, or sawn off a wall somewhere.
Yeah,
Or like the head. When you see the head only, that means that there's another half of that statue headless around somewhere, right?
right.
Because people would go around chopping the heads off of them because they thought the face was so beautiful.
Oh man.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man, yeah. And that you see that all over the world. You see in order for these pieces to be where they are, it means that there was some destruction in a lot of cases in order for it to get to you, because it wasn't intended to travel. Now, the other side of it is that there are pieces, and in fact, my dissertation, one of these days I'll do a workshop on my dissertation, the 4 statues that I did my dissertation on were these portable bronzes. So oftentimes, that's why tankas, I think, were created, and that's why the portable bronzes were created and such, because suddenly there were people who were traveling around the world and saying, I want to be able to take this with me. I want to be able to show it to someone else or to sell it to someone else. And so we need a portable form. And so that's how these things started to come into being.
Well, this goes to another question though I have is so for example, there was a long time they didn't portray the Buddha.
Yeah.
He wasn't portrayed. And then
Right.
he was portrayed.
Yes.
And I know that, like for example, it became a practice to recall the Buddha, and having a statue or a little piece you could carry with you was a way of recalling the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
But that's when that happened and why that happened. Is there any theories on that?
There are quite some good theories about it. In fact, Robert DiCaroli is the one academic who's written a book about his theories about why it happened and where it happened. And I have to say, I've only read parts of the book, although I do know Rob, and I'm actually auditing a class with him right now on contemporary Indian art.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, one starting point is to say there never was a prohibition exactly. There's not any place in the suttas or anything that the Buddha said or any place where we could see why they wouldn't have been depicting the Buddha as a human being, except out of respect that he had kind of transcended human form.
Right.
So there's that. And then there is definitely, you know, some exposure to other cultures that happened in Gandhara. So we know that the earliest depictions, the actual earliest human form of the Buddha happened in two places, roughly around the same time. And we don't think influenced by each other necessarily, just kind of spontaneously in two different places. One is Gandhara, which is that Central Asian region of Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Mhm.
And the other one is Mathura, which is in the northern part of India, in a place which was very close to actually where the Buddhist clan was from. So it's sort of spontaneously started rising around 500 years after the Buddha. And, you know, part of my feeling about it is like, right, the further and further we get away from the time of the actual Buddha, the more that people felt his absence, right? The more that people felt the wanting to have his presence and not being able to have his presence, you know? And especially I think about these regions where the monasticism was lost or had never actually been there yet, right? And so there are people who are getting exposed to Buddhism and they're getting exposed to these wonderful teachings of the Buddha, and yet they kind of don't really have any supports. And then they're exposed to what? Persian art, Roman art, Chinese art, right? They're exposed, there's this whole multicultural thing happening. And somebody said, well, why don't we show what he would have looked like? Why would we not try to relate to that?
That's really interesting. Yeah, especially with the Silk Road.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with the Silk Road and
Mm-hmm.
all that commerce and interactivity with different cultures
Yep.
makes perfect sense.
Yep, exactly. And both of those two places, Mathura and Gandhara, were places where there was a huge amount of trade and travel and people and goods moving and all kinds of stuff happening, all kinds of ideas meeting and, you know,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
And the Greeks had been there too. I mean, they went
Right.
and
Alexander the Great got all the way down into that part of India.
yeah. But thank you.
Mhm.
A little question.
Yes.
So do you have any theories on those horses? I mean, that just seems so out of keeping.
Well, I'll tell you what, that woman, Angela Howard. So Angela started out thinking that he was Shakyamuni. And then later, years later, she looks at the piece again and she says, no, it's Vairocana. And all of that is neither here nor there, in my opinion. But one interesting thing that she did note is that there's a horse on the front of the piece. And the horse on the front of the piece is very different than the horses on the back. And so that's one, in my opinion, and I think probably Angela would agree, that some of that work that was done in the back was probably later and a different artist, actually.
Mhm.
That maybe originally the piece was only carved in the front and the sleeves. And then, you know, maybe people said we would like to circumambulate around this piece or something, right? It's like in the center of a room or something. And some artist said, well, yeah, then, you know, we need to like carve the back of it too and make it look pretty on the back, because right now it only looks pretty when you walk in, as you're walking in. or something like that could have happened. I think that my theory is something like that, that it's probably a later addition, especially that bottom piece, but maybe the whole back section was a later addition. Yeah.
So if you look at early Christian frescoes in the churches and things like that, it's not unusual for, they'll go in and they'll have like a little griffin down in the corner. They'll have these like fictional things like that, you sort of look at them and it's just like, well, that's not a real thing, but they'll create some sort of mythical thing that has nothing to do with Christianity, and they'll be sort of down in the corner or something like that. And it's almost like, well, they had a little extra space, and so we'll just put in something pretty.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
I like the earlier pieces. The first pieces was from the rail around the stupa, and how it reminded me of like Christian paintings with the angels in the air, It was really very much like that. It was really wow. And then the Gandharan pieces were like of the story of the Buddha. I loved all the people in it. We kept looking at all the different people, how they portrayed them. And each one was unique. Each person was unique.
Yes.
And really delightful. And those were really interesting pieces. The Buddha was very stoic, very everybody had emotion around him. Everybody was very kind of emotion, but he was very still and very stoic, and very straight-faced. And everybody else was like very interesting. And those were really delightful pieces.
Yes.
And it just made me think too, well, in India, there's a lot of people always around. We're like, that's one of the thoughts I had when I looked at those pieces. Just lots of people around the Buddha. Yeah. Even when he was alone. But then, he says when he awakened, all beings awakened.
Yes.
Awakened
Yes. But do you think he means like there were a bunch of beings around?
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
but
okay.
it was just really, well, it was depicted that way though,
Yes, yes. And that is an interesting technique. So, there was an art historian named Dhammadīpā, who's excellent, absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that she did was she came up with some ideas, these different forms. Now, see, you guys are great because you get me to think about all these little details that I have notes on. So Vidya Dihejya's modes of visual narration. So she came up with these theories because, sometimes you see a scene and it kind of doesn't make sense because like you see the Buddha in the moment of awakening, and then there's all these people around, but there weren't all those people around when he was awakening, or at least that's not how he tells the story, right? He was sitting alone under the tree in Bodh Gaya. So she has these different modes. She came up with seven different modes. And one of them is called the synoptic. And the synoptic is where you see multiple episodes in the same frame. So you see the main character once, but you see multiple sort of scenarios in the same one image.
Right.
And so I believe that's one of those. That's one of those synoptic images.
Well, it was kind of like all of them would be together in one place, all four pieces that we saw. They'll be like lined up together.
Yep. Or like different moments in time sort of superimposed on one another is the way that I think about it, like different frames from the film sort of mashed together. Or like the piece from Barhut, there is an art historian who at the Smithsonian actually, who thinks that piece is showing the same couple moving around the piece, that's just multiple images of the same couple. Whereas to me, it looks like different people, but it's up for interpretation.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I never heard it called that before, that idea. I've seen murals like that where they have the same people in the mural. It'd be like and so you would see it. Actually, one I saw was a Day of the Dead one. It was a wedding where everybody was skeletons, but they're all dressed up and like at a fiesta, a wedding fiesta. And there's the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. there's angel skeletons and devil skeletons, and they're drinking together and they're having a great time. There's music, and it's a fabulous thing. But it has that idea: the bride and groom at the beginning, the bride and groom in the middle, the bride and groom in the evening.
Yeah, which is a different one actually. That's a linear. She would call that a linear, where you have successive panels.
I like that though. It's a very interesting idea.
It is, and it helps because, you know, in India, again, you had all different kinds of concepts around how to tell a story on, you know, carving a big piece of rock. Yeah. All right, folks. Well, I think that we have pretty much covered everything that I wanted to cover tonight. So thanks so much for your beautiful reflections and questions. It's great. And we'll be putting the recording up on YouTube as usual. And yeah, I will send you, everybody who gave their email, I will send you a link to the presentation so you can have another look. You can see the recording on YouTube, and then there'll also be an evaluation form if you all have a minute to just share about that, since this whole series of art workshops is a new offering for me. And so it's helpful to know.
It's great. Thank you so much for your time. It takes so much work to put these things together, and they're so great.
It was really enjoyable.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. I was looking forward to it all day.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you very
Good
much.
night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.